Thank you so much. Just gonna get all my windows organized here. And set myself a little timer. All right, yeah. Thank you so much for that introduction. That's great. Before I get started, I just also wanted to quickly acknowledge that I'm coming from Toronto or Takaranto, which is broadly it's situated upon the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, and that this land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. As was just stated, my name is Andrew Bailey, and today I'm going to be talking about my current postdoctoral research creation project, which is currently hosted at the Technoculture Art and Games Research Lab at Concordia University. There I'm producing, as we just heard, a digital archive focused on Canadian independent game development, primarily focused on a designer named Maddie Thorson, a Canadian designer who I'm going to be speaking about more extensively throughout this presentation. As was just said, the archive is mainly or predominantly envisioned as a pedagogical tool for educators hoping to bring Canadian video game history into their classrooms. My presentation today argues for the historical value of web archiving game developer websites and uses Maddie Thorson's website, Maddie Makes Games, as a case study. She's designed this website herself and regularly updated it for over the last 2 decades. So there's quite a wealth of content to look at, going back through archival snapshots on the Wayback Machine. Within this archival context, I also argue that Thorson's website offers a unique window into the evolution of her creative practice. And since she began making games in the early 2000s, and also a way to trace her journey from initial early prototypes and game mods to more recent releases of her quite successful commercial games. All right. So here we have a photo of Maddie Thorson. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about who Maddie Thorson was, just to give some context to my arguments. As I mentioned, she's a Canadian independent game designer who's best known for the indie platforming game Celeste. Also here on this slide in the photo, which I pulled from a relatively recent interview with Rolling Stone, features a bunch of concept art and character designs from another one of her commercially successful games called Towerfall. For most of her career, Thorson has worked under the developer title or the studio title Maddie Makes Games, but more recently, following the unexpected or large success of Celeste, has since rebranded to the less name-specific Extremely OK Games. Oops. And just again, a little bit more context for Thorson and her career before getting to the website. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with Celeste, which a game I mentioned a couple of times, it's a 2D pixel art side-scrolling platformer game that is aesthetically and mechanically quite similar in many ways to the older Super Mario games. On the slide, I just have pictured the store page from the Steam platform with some tags and descriptions added. Narratively, Celeste presents the story of Madeline, who's a young red-haired trans woman who's attempting to climb a fantastical version of the real-world Celeste Mountain in British Columbia, Canada. The journey is both physical and emotional, with the game using Madeline's tricky ascent up the mountain as a metaphor for the character's ongoing struggles with anxiety, self-doubt, and depression. This connection is further symbolized by her frequent encounters with a shadowy version of herself called Badeline, who embodies her inner fears and negative self-talk. Overall, Celeste uses arduous platforming challenges in combination with an encouraging approach to accessibility and difficulty to communicate messages of persistence and growth, which many fans have enthusiastically responded to on social media and through the creation of paratexts such as YouTube video essays, Twitch speedruns, and customized levels and art assets. Just speaking a little bit to its reception, or more extensively to its reception, Celeste has won a number of Game of the Year awards when it was first released in 2018 and has since sold several million copies, firmly cementing its place within the canon of video game history. Getting back to a little bit more of the web archiving context, in addition to how Celeste presents a positive and supportive representation of those suffering from anxiety and depression, in the time immediately following the game's release, it was also quickly read as a queer text, with many players interpreting Madeline as a trans woman, especially due to her initially tense relationship with her shadow self, Badeline, whom she eventually learns to accept and love while climbing the mountain. Although Madeline's transness is only loosely hinted at in the original version of Celeste, approximately a year after the game's initial release, the development team updated the game with a free playable epilogue that contained a few scenes that much more explicitly communicated Madeline's trans identity. This consisted of a trans and queer flag shown on Madeline's desk and some photos of Madeline as a child where she had a short pageboy haircut. Although for many queer fans, this additional content helped to positively canonize their initial reading of Madeline's gender identity, for others, the ongoing lack of fully explicit textual confirmation was read as a hesitancy. Oops, I'm going two slides or two screens. I changed one and I forgot to change my other. So these are the images I was just referring to. A hesitancy on the developer's part to publicly commit to positive trans representation. In response to the community's polarized reaction to the epilogue update, Maddie Thorson, Celeste, who wrote, directed, and co-programmed Celeste, published a post on her Medium blog that has since been archived on her personal website, confirming that yes, Madeline is officially trans, and that the initial ambiguousness of her gender identity had a lot to do with Thorson's own history of anxiety and depression, and her decision to initially come out as non-binary throughout the game's development, and eventually transition while she was writing and developing Celeste. Furthermore, this blog post pictured on the left of the slide here serves as a crucial paratext for understanding both the game's narrative and its reception. Yet, like many personal reflections hosted on third-party platforms such as Medium, it remains vulnerable to deletion or decay. This is partially alleviated through Thorson's own archiving of the post on her website, but also works to emphasize the increasing value of born digital paratexts within the realm of video game history. And here I just want to stop to help contextualize part of my postdoctoral project's focus. I'm really interested in paratext and like archiving and the historical value of paratext, and to start contextualize this within the space of game studies and video games. And I want to point to this quote by Canadian game studies scholar Mia Consalvo. Consalvo pioneered how the field of game studies has come to approach the concept of paratext in her 2007 book Cheating, where she expanded on Gerard Genet's original literary definition of the term to include a much wider variety of peripheral artifacts such as guides, walkthroughs, cheats, mods, reviews, user-generated content, and promotional ephemera, arguing that, quote, before a video game is ever released, paratextual communication and artifacts relating to it spring up like mushrooms. And although being a video game expert is supposed to be about skill and knowledge about games, it is often through the consumption of paratexts, not actual games, that this knowledge can be gained. Although here I'm quite drawn to Consalvo's fungal framing of game paratexts, what I find most important about this quote is, or what Consalvo is saying here, is that video game paratexts are emphasized as being potentially more influential than playing the games themselves for people seeking to educate themselves about the medium and its culture. A sentiment I find to be particularly useful in the context of video game archiving, where long-term playability is a notorious problem due to obsolescence and emulation-related legal barriers. To help illustrate what I'm perceiving as a gap in institutional video gaming archiving efforts, especially those around born digital paratexts, I now want to briefly point to the recently published 2024 International Video Game Preservation Survey report that was conducted by the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia, which surveyed a wide variety of video game heritage organizations from around the world. In this chart, documenting the composition of each organization's collections, we can see that the majority of these archives are not collecting born digital paratexts, such as web archives of developer websites, as I'm discussing in relation to Thorson's website, but also things like YouTube and Twitch streams, or web archives of game reviews or social media posts. Like there's just a lot of stuff that's not necessarily being collected. This is not to say that these organizations are unconcerned with paratextual material. However, there seems to be a much more common focus on physical artifacts such as magazines and books or printed promotional ephemera, rather than the web archives of Thorson's website that I'm discussing here today. And although I'm arguing that there is a gap in institutional efforts to collect these various categories of born digital paratexts, That is not to say that there's an equal scholarly gap in researchers who have begun publishing work on the topic, especially those who are interested in amateur archiving efforts that are led by fans rather than professionals. To help construct my arguments on the value of creating and analyzing web archives of developer websites, I've been looking to the work of scholars like Abigail de Kosnik and her concept of rogue archives, Seawald and Vollen's historical approach to video game paratexts, and Swalwell et al.'s work on fan-led games preservation efforts. And then just a little bit more literature review to help me specifically address Thorson's identity as a trans game developer and the gendered nuances of analyzing archival snapshots of her professional website. I've been looking to the work of folks like Avery Phelan Dame and Lane Nooney, who both take intersectional, affective, and embodied approaches to their work on media archaeology and digital history. All right. So with all that introduction, term definition, getting Maddie Thorson introduced and summarized out of the way, I want to come back to the object of my research, which is Thorson's website. It is well beyond the scope of this presentation to cover the entirety of the website in its current state, never mind its slow evolution across the last 25 years and the various Wayback Machine snapshots that I've been looking at. But for this presentation, I want to focus on the brief history of a very interesting mod, a game mod, like or a ROM hack that Thorson made of a game called Super Mario World that was originally released for the Super Nintendo. And the mod is called Supersonic Saves the World World. It's pictured here on the slide in the ROM hacking section, third from the top. For those unfamiliar with the practice of ROM hacking, it is one of the oldest forms of player modding or fan modding of games, where somebody tinkers with the more often than not pirated read-only memory file of an older game. And typically these are cartridge-based games for like the Nintendo or the Sega Genesis, but not exclusively so. And this type of tinkering often has the purpose of producing some new variation of an original game that can include replacing art assets or creating custom levels, translating a game that might not necessarily have been translated before, or just maybe simple bug fixes or quality of life additions, things like that. So for this reason and more, archives of ROM files are seen by many within the field of games preservation as being a necessary yet legally gray tool for providing access to obsolete, out of print, or untranslated older games. And subsequently, creative practices such as the ROM hacking that Thorson has featured on her website here have become an inherently controversial way of engaging with video game history. Websites that host ROMs and ROM hacks are relatively, or they're commonly served with takedown notices from large video game publishers such as Nintendo, who are adverse to people playing around with their intellectual property. And looking more specifically at Thorson's Supersonic Saves the World ROM hack and the legal issues involved with ROM hacking that I just outlined, I now want to focus on the README text document that comes packaged alongside the ROM file in most places that it's available to download on Thorson's website or beyond, as I'll be getting into in a second. The full content of the note is much longer than I have time to go over for the purposes of this presentation, but I want to take a moment to read this section dedicated to the intended accreditation and sharing of the ROM hack. To be clear, the author is asking you not to upload this work to any public-facing download repositories such as smwcentral.net or romhacking.net. To the administrators of such communities, the author humbly requests that you delete all traces of this work if it is ever found within your databases. The author's wish is that this work spreads solely in an organic, intimate fashion. If a friend, acquaintance, or stranger requests it from you, judge for yourself whether it is appropriate to share. If you know someone who would enjoy it, reach out to them. And when it eventually vanishes from the internet due to carelessness, a lack of interest, or some other preventable calamity, so be it. Additionally, anyone who claims to be the author of this work is a liar. The true author will never publicly acknowledge their creation of this work. So although the ROM hack is hosted on Thorson's website now, that wasn't always the case when it was originally being distributed and YouTubers were making videos of it, and you would see people talking about it in online forums. It was being spread around in this very, passing it around kind of organic manner, not hosted directly on Thorson's website or any of the repositories that is outlined in this slide. And But fans quickly linked the project to Maddie Thorson. The document itself is signed with allegedly Maddie, and the title screen of the ROM hack also lists the game being written by Maddie allegedly. Many people linked this to Maddie Thorson due to her well-known history of creating similar ROM hacks and having hosted other ones on her website, and by making logical deductions based on the websites, YouTube channels, and podcasts that first began producing content related to the mod, many of which were known to be in the same social or professional networks as Thorson. Oops. Another relatively obvious clue confirming Thorson's playfully pseudo-anonymous authorship are several nods to her trans identity that can be found in the ROM hack, which is something that Thorson has done in other places, such as the epilogue I was mentioning earlier for Celeste. Looking at all of the text documents, instructions, in combination with the notable authorial flourishes within the game, there is an interesting tension I see at play. Thorson very explicitly is concerned with how the work is being credited and distributed and potentially forgotten. But she assigned her name in a kind of non-committal, partial, and pseudo-anonymous joking manner. Furthermore, she has directly asked for the work not to be archived in the same way that most other ROM hacks of its kind typically are on community-run websites like SMW Central or romhacking.net. Here, I see in this tension, I see a challenging of typical ROM hacking and fan archiving practices that resonates with the playful and often mischievous methods of counter-archival artwork and experimental community archiving projects. However, to look at this another way, this may not be an entirely playful move, but a form of preemptive self-protection from legal action, especially because of how she is a relatively notable public figure in popular video game culture following the enormous critical and commercial success of Celeste. Whether or not Thorson's instructions for fans to not archive Supersonic Saves the World and only distribute it directly between individuals were sincere, the ROM hack quickly made its way on to platforms like the Internet Archive and the repositories that I listed in the previous slide. Did Thorson honestly think that her fans would not upload the ROM hack anywhere, or was this merely a provocation or a challenge for audiences to critically reconsider the standards and norms of the ROM hacking community? There is something to be said that with her instructions, Thorson made the act of archiving her ROM hack twice as illicit as it normally would have been. Anyone doing this would not only be participating in the regular pirate networks that most ROM hackers participate in and that Nintendo regularly targets, but the uploader would also be contradicting the hack creator's artistic wishes. And coming to the end of this ROM hack story, Supersonic Save the World has now been archived on Thorson's personal website alongside many of her other ROM hacks and open source ROM hacking tools. Of potential significance is that the actual files for the hack are not hosted directly on her site, but are linked to its page on smwcentral.net, which further solidifies some of my speculation around Thorson being careful about the legally gray status of the ROM hack. In this presentation, I've outlined how Maddie Thorson has creatively played with video game history using online fan archives and eventually her website as a vector for counter-archival expression. To conclude, I want to highlight the importance of documenting developer websites as vital records of digital cultural production, and argue that by examining maddiemakesgames.com as both a personal and public archive, that my project contributes to discussions of internet histories and digital interculturality, revealing how the creative practices surrounding indie games foster new forms of identity work, queer representation, and cultural memory online. Ultimately, when it's finished, I hope for this project to reconsider how we document and preserve the evolving narratives of game creators in an era of decentralized digital archives. Thanks. No, I got right up close to time there.